Good evening. I call this meeting of the Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee to order. This is Tuesday, August 2nd. We are in the council chambers of City Hall. Second item of business is to identify any conflicts of interest. Having been given the agenda ahead of time, does anybody have anything they wish to announce as a potential conflict of interest? Seeing none, we'll move on to number 3, citizens' comments. Do we have any citizens wishing to address the committee this evening? Any citizens' comments? Third time, citizens' comments? Seeing none, we will move on to number 4, consent agenda, which include minutes of the July 19th, 2022 meeting, the bills and payroll, and the monthly position control report. What are your wishes? I have a motion by Mr. Wagner to approve as submitted, a second by Mr. Hendler. Any questions, discussion, or other comments that wish to be addressed? Seeing none, we'll take action. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda, please say aye.
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 Opposed? That motion carries. Number 5, consideration of items removed. There were none. Number 6, request to recommend council approval of proposed request for proposals for financial audit services presented by Steve Barg, City Administrator.
Thank you. Last month, the committee and council subsequently authorized us to work on an RFP, request for proposals for financial audit services. Just a real brief background, not to go over everything that we did at the last meeting, but we've had CLA as our auditor, formerly Schenck, since 2013. Started out with a 5-year agreement, and subsequently we've done two-year extensions. Staff of both the city and Marshfield utilities who do joint RFPs with us for audit services believed that it was time to do a full-blown RFP to find out what else is out there, what other companies have to offer, what their prices are, those types of things. So as I said, the committee and council were favorable to moving forward. What you have before you tonight is a request for proposals that we would like to send out with committee and council approval on August 10th, the day after the council meeting. You see the schedule outlined in the RFP. And one of the things I didn't have on the agenda here, but there's a reason why I didn't, is that we would like to appoint a review team to go through them, a mix of staff and council, whoever would like to be involved in that. And I would look to make that appointment at the council meeting rather than at this meeting when everyone is present to weigh in on that. So the recommended action tonight would be to recommend council approval of the proposed request for proposals for financial audit services jointly between the City of Marshfield and Marshfield Utilities.
What are your wishes? I have a motion by Mrs. Tompkins to approve. Second by Mr. Wagner. Discussion. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and vote on that action. All those in favor of the motion, say aye.
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 Opposed? That motion carries. Number 7, request to recommend council approval of revised policy number 3.3900, tolerance for workplace violence and weapons, presented by Sarah Dreschel,
Thank you.
Human Resources Director.
Thank you. Just to give a little background, on July 12th, council did approve for us to remove the signage from City Hall that prohibits the firearms and other weapons in the building, and those have been removed. With that removal, we did do a thorough examination of the overall policy that is in our personnel policies. That is 3.390, titled Zero Tolerance for Violence and Weapons in the Workplace. Some of the changes that are recommended include taking out the information regarding zero tolerance weapons specifically policy. That is taking out a whole section there. Also exceptions and other information in there. Additionally, it is changing HR manager to HR director in a few spots. And one additional note, under the purpose of the policy, it would also be removing the words "and weapons" so that it flows through. So it would essentially be changing the policy to a zero tolerance for workplace violence and removing weapons from the verbiage of that policy. So So Finance, Budget, and Personnel Committee recommend council approval of revised personnel policy number 3.390.
What's your pleasure?
Move
Mr.
to
Handler?
recommend to council for action.
Okay, so Mr. Wagner has made a motion to move this on to council for approval. Was that a second, Mr. Handler? Okay. Discussion.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Wagner.
Okay, essentially, all we did is remove everything that referred to guns or weapons. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and basically what it boils down to is zero tolerance for any kind of violence in the workplace.
Correct.
Okay, and that's the way I read it. But and how that original policy? I know you had the date in there, but I can't remember what the original date of that policy was.
The original was in 1999. It was updated in 2011. It was when the original act kind of came about, and it put a little bit more specific verbiage in there. The weapons piece has always been a piece since the original policy.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments? I guess I'm kind of wondering, since the sign was removed from City Hall only, how does this affect other locations where city employees are working?
That,
Go ahead.
okay.
We didn't talk about who was going to answer.
Very good question. Basically, how everything is dictated as far as law goes, essentially with taking it out of here and taking the information out of the policy, weapons, conceal and carry would hold here. And then in other buildings, as long as there's signage, then they would not be allowed.
And if I can add to that, I mean, we have learned since this meeting that there may be different things that we knew or didn't know in terms of whether other buildings are signed. Just to recap a little bit, the Fire and Police Commission has the authority over whether those two buildings are signed. And I think the police chief has told us before that they are required to be prohibiting weapons, in their building. The library board certainly has domain over that facility, and they've been very ardent about the fact that they want to continue that. They have the signs posted, and they want to not permit any firearms or other weapons in their building. The other buildings, when the council made this decision, we really didn't talk about streets, wastewater, Second Street Community Center, and those kind of buildings. So at this point, I'm not sure whether or not they have signs, which ones do, which ones don't. So we really haven't addressed that at this point. That may be something we want to talk about in the future. But the council was very clear in its motion that it pertained specifically to City Hall at the time that was passed.
It's my understanding, and perhaps this is a topic for another day, but it's my understanding that there are multiple buildings that prohibit firearms within the city. City Hall was very clearly identified as the only building to be adjusted based on the action by the council. What policy did that overturn? In other words, what had been passed to post those signs, because it's my understanding those signs were posted due to previous council action. What ordinance did that adjust? What other properties does that ordinance cover? And with certain buildings still being identified, how does this change to policy, I guess, affect employees at those locations? Those are a lot of questions that I have that I'm not certain are fully vetted in the policy change. I mean, I understand we have to make the change because of City Hall, but I have some other questions related to those other.
I know Sarah did some looking into this, and it seems to me that, signs we're fairly silent on those, as opposed to what you found in the zero tolerance, which does specifically talk about having weapons or firearms, correct?
Correct.
So, I mean, a signage is, if there is a place that the council ever authorized, we want signs posted on these buildings, I don't believe we've come across it at this point.
No.
But I do think there's some cleanup needed on this, because I know, Justin, you raised a question about Second Street Community Center. Other remote facilities may have some of the same questions that will come up now going forward that were not addressed by the council's motion that night, nor are they specifically addressed by this policy, because this policy doesn't talk about posting signs.
Okay. One last question I guess I have also that surprises me in what's being removed. It's my understanding that this is a personnel policy. It's specifically listed under personnel. And yet the policy very clearly, the part that's being removed also lists visitors, guests, vendors, and anyone else. Are there other aspects of our personnel policy that potentially affect more than just personnel, and how are those enforced? And it's not something you have to answer now, but it's something that I'd like to have some information on.
Definitely.
If I could follow up on what I said, if the committee decides that they would like to see a more thorough review of what we have left in the wake of the decision about this building in terms of what other buildings have what signs or how they operate, that may be appropriate, but I'll look for this committee's direction before I would bring something like that to you.
Any other questions or comments? Yes. Mrs. Tompkins.
Well, I think we also need to realize that we just need to bring into the discussion city garage, waste management, all of these other sites. We can't just talk about one site if we're going to change an entire policy.
I think the reason City Hall got the main focus going back to 2019, the first time this topic was discussed, is because that is the primary place that citizens come in to do business. I'm not saying they don't come to the street building. I'm not saying they don't end up at the wastewater building at some point, but this is where we get the customer traffic, and this is where some of the concerns were raised over time by people who felt they should be able to walk in here doing concealed carry.
Mr. Wagner?
Thank you, Mr. Witzel. The way I looked at this was, we have a zero tolerance for any kind of violence in the workplace at all. If there's violence that's chargeable under the terms of this act, under the terms of this policy, it doesn't matter whether they use fists or guns. It's still policy. So the violence is what we're after. The guns are an afterthought. And I think they made the policy very clear this way. And I also think they made it very clear that it pertained only to this building. And if we have to have a discussion about the other buildings, we need to do that. But so far, I think this answers the question that the council asked. The council was asked a week or so ago, or a couple of weeks ago. Do we want to have a sign for guns in the city hall, a sign prohibiting guns in city hall? And the answer to that is no. That being the case, the ordinance, the policy dealing with City Hall has been revised. That's my opinion on it.
I think the only reason you would need to have the conversation I talked about is if there are staff leaders at those remote facilities, questioning what they are or are not supposed to do. And, maybe if you wanted to bubble up from us, we can do it that way instead.
Any other questions, comments? All right, we have a motion to approve the policy as presented. All those in favor say aye. I'm sorry, you have a question?
Aye.
Mrs. Tompkins? Yeah, to approve it at the committee level and take it to council for final approval. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase that. We have the motion in front of us to recommend this be sent to council for approval. All those in favor say aye, please.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Number 8, request to recommend council approval of revised policy number 3.520, sick leave, presented by Sarah Dressel, Human Resource Director.
Thank you. This policy is with regard to the sick leave and how it is used. The additions and changes to this would be to add a section regarding being able to utilize 80 hours of sick leave for quarantine time due to a CDC identified pandemic illness. Previously, it had been specific to COVID-19. As we know, that is ever changing, as well as the idea that there could be future pandemics. This way, if we keep it to a CDC identified pandemic illness, we aren't needing to revisit this. And so that was a change that was recommended. Additionally, one note that was recognized after this was sent through, under the sick leave administration, which is A, number 2B, it talks specifically about Marshfield Police Department sergeants. Sergeants would need to be changed to lieutenants, which I was made aware of afterwards. So that would be something that we would need to adjust as well. So Finance and Budget Personnel Committee recommend council approval of revised personnel policy number 3.520.
What's your desire?
Motion to approve.
I have a motion by Mrs. Tompkins to approve. Second by Mr. Wagner. Any questions or discussion? The only comment I'd like to make is I do appreciate that you have identified it as CDC identified pandemic illness rather than being very COVID specific. Thank you. Seeing no further discussion. Oh,
Yeah.
Mr. Wagner?
I'm assuming that the motion to recommend it for approval to the council includes the change from sergeant to lieutenant. Or, yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Further questions or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Next, number 9, adjourn to closed session pursuant to Wisconsin statutes, chapter 19.85, sub 1, sub C, considering employment, promotion, compensation, or performance evaluation data of any public employee which a governmental body has jurisdiction or exercises responsibility, specifically promotion and establishing pay rate for accountant. Mr. Wagner has a motion to go into closed session. Second by Mrs. Tompkins. Roll call vote, please.
Witzel,
Yes.
Wagner,
Yes.
Tompkins, Hendler, Spiros.
Yes.
We are in closed session. We're back in open session. During closed session, we discussed possible promotion and pay rate for accountant position. What are your pleasure? What's your pleasure? Mr. Wagner?
I would make a motion that we accept the classification of, let's see, class 128, step 2 for the new position, and that the recommendation of the finance director or Ms. Gregor to be promoted into that position to be accepted.
Okay. So we have a motion to accept the promotion and establish pay rate. Is that a second, Mr. Hendler? Yes, a second by Mr. Hendler. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Nay. That motion carries. Number 11, actions on matters, we did that. Number 12, discuss our suggested items for future agendas. Any suggestions? Seeing none and seeing all action before this committee is complete, I will declare this meeting adjourned.